Welcome back. I'm Muggsy, and today I'm going to explain inflorescences. In this video, I'll explain what an inflorescence is, as well as describe the differences between the different types of inflorescences and go through examples of all the major types of inflorescences. With that being said, we should probably start with what is an inflorescence? If you think of a typical flowering plant, an angiosperm, you think of a stem and a flower at the top. I'm just going to draw a bud because I don't want to spend a lot of time drawing individual flowers. I have another video on the anatomy of flowers. You can look at that if you're more interested in the parts of flowers themselves. This video is more about how flowers and flower buds are arranged on stems, and it's a lot more complicated than you might think. So we all learned this idea of a stem and a flower at the top when we're kids, but this idea of a solitary flower really only describes a minority of plants. Only a small number of plant species have solitary flowers. Most plants have branch points on this stem and other flowers attached. And so they don't have single solitary flowers, they have clusters of flowers, and we call these clusters of flowers inflorescences, which just means flowering, in bloom, right? The majority of flowering plant species out there have inflorescences instead of single solitary flowers. Now, some do have single solitary flowers like I drew earlier. So for example, a lot of lilies, like you might think of tulips, tulip trees for that matter. Liriodendron has solitary flowers, magnolia, trilliums. Lots of species have individual flowers, but the majority have these clusters of inflorescences. So given that the majority of flowering plants have inflorescences, it's somewhere around 70% by species versus 30% for solitary flowers. A curious mind might wonder, why? What's the advantage? Why have inflorescences? Well, there's several reasons. The first and perhaps most obvious reason is increased pollinator attraction. If you have a bunch of flowers all together, they're going to send a much stronger signal in terms of their color, their smell, all these sorts of things than a single flower. So pollinators will be able to see them from further away. And even if they see an inflorescence and a solitary flower at the same distance, they'll be more attracted to the inflorescence because it's going to have more color, more pollen, all that kind of stuff. The second big evolutionary benefit of having these inflorescences is that pollinators are actually going to prefer them to a solitary flower. The reason for this being, it's very easy to visit one flower, then another, then another, then another, versus with solitary flowers, you might have to fly some distance from one flower to another. So even though each individual flower in an inflorescence may be smaller than a solitary flower, there's many more of them, and studies show that pollinators prefer to visit these inflorescences. Another reason to have an inflorescence is temporal availability. What I mean by this is that pollinators spend a lot of their time just trying to find flowers that are ready to visit. Meaning it doesn't do you any benefit as a bumblebee to visit a plant that's not in flower, or to visit a plant that doesn't have any pollen or nectar left, right? So you spend a lot of your time looking for the plants that are perfect for pollination, that have pollen and nectar. And the great thing about a lot of these inflorescences, like a sunflower, as you'll see later in this video, is that a sunflower has many, many different flowers on its big flower head called a capitulum. And these flowers mature at different times. So every day during the course of, let's say, a week, there's new flowers open and available. So if you're a bee, if you know where a sunflower is, you know you can come back every day for a week and get pollen and nectar. That's a really good deal. So you don't have to spend your time and energy looking for flowers to pollinate. You know exactly where these flowers are going to be, so you can come back day after day after day. That's another huge benefit of these inflorescences. A final benefit of having an inflorescence versus solitary flowers is a little bit more in the weeds, but remember, plants want to spread their genes from one plant to another so they get genetic diversity amongst their offspring. They also, in a pinch, don't really mind spreading their genes from themselves to themselves because they're still going to get offspring, and so that's good, right? As long as your genes go on to the next generation, that's going to be good for evolution. But an interesting thing about self-pollination is that your offspring aren't going to be the same as you. For instance, if I reproduce with myself, there's two ways I could do it. I could just make clones, like cut off my finger, and then my finger would grow into a new Mugsy, and then I would regrow the finger. That's one way. In that case, there's no genetic diversity. I'm the same as my clone. But if I did some kind of sexual reproduction with myself, if I made eggs and sperm and they came together, you would think, just offhand, that those would also be clones of me, because they just contain my genes. But remember, every time cells go through the process of meiosis to make eggs and sperm, they end up with only half of the chromosomes. And there's different events that occur during that process, such as crossing over, variable assortment, all these sorts of things that produce a different set of my genes in each of my sperm. And if I produced eggs in each of my eggs. So if these sperm and eggs come together, they would actually be different from me. They'd be different mixes. And theoretically, I could make a mix. This is very weird to say, but if I could sexually reproduce with myself, theoretically, I could produce something that's very similar to my dad. It's like only my dad's genes for the most part. And I could produce something that's very similar to my mom. It's only my mom's genes. I could produce something, and then I could produce everything that's in between, including myself. So you can make all these weird mixes even if you reproduced sexually, not asexually, with yourself. So when plants self-pollinate, meaning if a bee visits one flower on an inflorescence and just goes right next door to the next flower and pollinates that flower, there's still some diversity that's going to occur. Now, there won't be any new genes that you would get from visiting an entirely new plant, but you're going to mix the existing genes of the parent plant in a way that does create new and interesting offspring that could be valuable from an evolutionary perspective. So that goes a long ways to say that an inflorescence has more of this self-pollination, where a bee or something would visit one flower on an inflorescence and then visit the flower next door. And in that case, they would pollinate that flower and create something that's kind of similar to the parent plant, but not exactly the same. So that's also of some benefit. Of course, as I say in all these videos, it is better to mix your genes with an entirely different individual, because then you get something new and interesting. But it's not a terrible idea to mix your genes with yourself, and it's really easy, right? Like, it might be hard for a bee to go from one flower to a totally different flower somewhere else. It's going to be really easy for them to just crawl over the flower head to the next flower in the inflorescence. So, evolutionary benefits of inflorescences: they're easy to see, they're easy to visit, there's lots of resources for pollinators, so pollinators actually prefer them, they can come back day after day after day, and if you can't get your genes from one plant to another, you could at least get your genes from one flower on an inflorescence to the next flower, which still confers some evolutionary benefit. Now remember, we still have something like 30% of plant species that have solitary flowers, so there must be some sort of benefit to that. And indeed, there are plenty. It does take more resources to make a big inflorescence than compared to making a single solitary flower. And particularly when you think of like early season bulbs, like crocuses and snowdrops and daffodils and that sort of thing, they almost all have solitary flowers. There are some exceptions, of course. And the reason for this is there's less competition that early in the season, right? These are plants whose entire evolutionary strategy is to get started really early, make a flower, and then do all their photosynthesis, and then kind of go dormant later in the year. So they don't have to compete with the bulk of plants that really do their flowering in mid to late summer, that sort of thing, or even late spring. And so they don't need to have a big showy inflorescence. They can just get by with a single solitary flower. They'll also have kind of bigger flowers that tend to attract bigger pollinators like bumblebees. Bumblebees, because they're so massive, they can get started earlier than other bees and butterflies and other pollinators that really need a warmer season to get started flying around and pollinating and stuff. So there are plenty of good reasons to have these single solitary flowers, especially with like an early pollination strategy like we see in a lot of these early bulbs. When thinking of inflorescences, we really have two main types. There's this type where we have our stem and it sets its flower buds at definite amounts. So at the tip of the stem, there's a bud. So no more buds can grow. So this plant will have 3 flowers and then it'll be done. It has already determined how many flowers it's going to produce. And as such, we describe this as determinate. The other type is you have your stem and you have flower buds on that stem. But as the season goes along, if it's a particularly long, warm summer, or if there's lots of moisture, or whatever environmental conditions this plant needs to keep producing flowers, it will do so. So at the top here of the stem, there isn't a flower bud, there's basically some tissue that will just continue to grow and grow and grow and produce more flowers as the season goes along. And then eventually, when it gets to the point where the plant realizes that it needs to start saving energy for next year and no longer produce flowers, it'll stop growing, and then these flowers will bloom, they'll die, they'll go through the whole cycle. So if this type of inflorescence is called determinate, it's predetermined how many flowers it has, then we'll call this type indeterminate, because it hasn't determined at the beginning of the season how many flowers it'll have. If it's a short season, maybe it'll just produce these 2 flowers. If it's medium, maybe it'll produce 4. If it's long, let's say it produces 6 or something like that. It hasn't yet determined. It's going to wait and see what the environmental conditions are. Most flowering plants have indeterminate inflorescences. Because this is just a better strategy for kind of dealing with the environmental conditions on the ground instead of just kind of calling your shots ahead of time like a determinate bloom. Now, this also works. These plants are perfectly fine and healthy and they're doing well, but this strategy is much more common. Okay, so let's start by looking at indeterminate inflorescences. There's many different types, and I'll diagram these so you can kind of see the difference between all the different ways of arranging flowers around a stem. The first type of indeterminate inflorescence that I want to talk about is a spike. You basically have a long stem, and on that stem you have flowers, lots of different flower buds. And remember, this is indeterminate, so it can keep growing as it needs. It can produce however many flowers the plant feels it should produce that year while still have enough energy to do all the other stuff it needs to do. These flowers don't have little tiny pedicels connecting them to this main stem. They're just directly connected to that main stem. This is different from another type of inflorescence, a raceme, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But spikes are actually fairly common out there. If you think of like salvia, that's a spike. Grasses tend to have spikes. People don't think of grasses and sedges as being flowering plants or having flowers at all, but if you look really closely, they have little tiny flowers. Sometimes it might just be stamens and carpels and not a bunch of pretty petals or anything like that, but they are flowers regardless and not cones or strobili or these reproductive structures of other types of plants. Grasses and sedges are flowering plants, and they tend to have their flowers arranged in spikes. Another good example with much bigger flowers that's easier to see is a gladiolus. Gladiolus have spike inflorescences. Their flowers are directly attached to their big, thick central stem. Okay, so that's a spike. As I said earlier, if these buds, instead of being attached directly to the main stem, if they have little stalks, we call this a raceme. And we call these little stalks pedicels. You can think of them as little tiny mini stems that connect a flower to the main inflorescence stem. Racemes, if you've seen my camas video, which is a great video, super long, camas flowers have a raceme structure. The flowers are in part of a raceme inflorescence. Racemes are actually quite common if you look out there. A lot of things that look like a spike, they actually have these little tiny pedicels attaching them. So these pedicels can be fairly long. They can also be very tiny. And in some cases, these pedicels are so short, it almost looks like you're dealing with a spike and not a raceme. And this is a good point in the video for me to say that these different inflorescence names, spikes, racemes, they weren't handed down to us from on high. They're just ways we've come up with as botanists to categorize these different inflorescences. In some cases, you can be forgiven for thinking something's a spike when it's really a raceme, or it's a raceme when it's really a spike. And even professional botanists make these mistakes all the time. And a lot of different sources will say a certain plant is a spike, and a different source will say it's a raceme, because some of these pedicels are so tiny it's hard to tell the difference. And some flowers are structured in such a way that you might have a hard time seeing if it's part of the flower that's attached to the main stem, right? Like here the flower's directly attached to the main stem. Or you might see this little part right here as a pedicel, right? So you'll be forgiven for mistaking some of these names because maybe even the official sources have it wrong. It's really hard to make these calls in a lot of cases. In other cases where these pedicels are nice and long and obvious, it's much more easy, like in fireweed, for example. In plant, I really enjoy elephant's head, where the flowers look like little elephant's heads. It looks like a spike to me, but all the sources say that this is a raceme because there's a tiny little, almost microscopic pedicel attaching the blooms to the stem. If it looks kind of like a spike, but instead of growing upwards, it's hanging down, and the flowers on the spike are unisexual. They're not both male and female, they're just male and just female, then we call this a catkin. And you're probably familiar with catkins on something like a willow tree, or, you know, lots of deciduous trees have catkins. To me, catkins look just like the strobili, the pollen cones of conifer plants, gymnosperms. And so when I was younger, I thought maybe these catkins are an example of the evolutionary link between gymnosperms and angiosperms. And so something like a willow tree is an angiosperm, but still has a flower that looks just like a gymnosperm. This actually turns out to be incorrect, at least according to molecular evidence. This is probably an example of convergent evolution, of gymnosperms and angiosperms diverging, the catkins, the flowers of those early angiosperms having big petals and lots of stamens and anthers and stuff. And then later on, some of those angiosperms found that wind pollination was really working for them, so they developed these really simplified flowers that kind of look like pollen cones, because it turns out with pollen cones of gymnosperms and also these catkins of angiosperms, this is a great way to do wind pollination. You don't need to muck about with like big petals and colorful petals. You really just need to dump a bunch of pollen out of your male flowers, and you need to have female flowers that have some way of kind of collecting that pollen, just like the cones and strobili of many gymnosperms do. So catkins are like a spike, they hang down, and they tend to be specialized for wind pollination instead of insect pollination. Remember, most flowering plants are specialized for insect pollination. That's the vast majority of the pollination that happens in flowering plants. But some, like plants that have catkins, and grasses are another example, they're more specialized for wind pollination. They still use wind pollination, it works great for them, why change? Okay, we're still talking about indeterminate inflorescences, but I want to talk about some that aren't necessarily arranged all along that main stem. So if this is my main stem, if that top part splits off into a bunch of pedicels that connect a bunch of blooms, and all of these pedicels are roughly the same length, and they all kind of roughly originate from the same point, we call this an umbel, which is very similar to an umbrella, which is kind of what this inflorescence looks like. Classic example of an umbel would be all your alliums, like onions and stuff. They very much have this umbel shape. In Apiaceae, like carrot flowers and Queen Anne's lace and all that kind of stuff, yarrow, you get kind of more, or sorry, not yarrow, cilantro and stuff. You get these more complex umbels of umbels. We'll talk about compound inflorescences later. But umbels are very cool looking. They're pretty easy to recognize. The secret is all of these pedicels are the same length, roughly, and they all roughly originate from the same point up at the top of the stem. If those pedicels don't originate from the same point and are all different lengths, but the flowers kind of exist in something like a plane. Now you'll notice this isn't a plane. It kind of looks like this. Sometimes they can exist in flat planes. Sometimes not, but at any rate, there's kind of a single surface to the inflorescence. We would call this a corym. So again, the corym is different from the umbel, mainly in that all of these pedicels are different lengths. You'll notice this one up here is pretty short, this one down here is pretty long, this one's pretty short, this one's pretty long, this one's in between. So the pedicels are different lengths, and they originate from different points. Remember, in an umbel, they all come out of the same point, just like that. That's not what's going on with a corym. With a corym, they originate from different points. And I grow a lot of yarrow. Yarrow is a classic example of a corym. All of the pedicels come out of different points, and the inflorescence has kind of what looks like a flat plane or maybe a rounded plane at the top. That's a corym. Some inflorescences look so much like a single flower that we call them Pseudanthia. Pseudo for false or not quite or almost, and anthos for flower, so false flowers. Some botanists think certain umbels look so much like a single flower they qualify as Pseudanthia. There's lots of different flowers out there that fall under this umbrella of being called a pseudanthium, a false flower. But there's really two types that I'd like to go over in this video, Capitula and Spadices. Let's start with that second one, a spadix. A spadix is a really interesting type of inflorescence. So we start, as we always do, with our big main stem that holds up the inflorescence, the peduncle. And then there's basically a large receptacle that looks kind of like a corn dog or something like that. It's elongated. And along that is where all the flowers are. And the flowers basically just look like tiny little bumps. They're not impressive at all. They tend not to have sepals or petals. They only have the reproductive parts. And they almost, to every final example, all the same, they all are unisexual. They're either male or female. Now that could be on different inflorescences. So this could be a whole male inflorescence, and there's another plant with a whole female inflorescence. But more commonly with these Spadices is they have male and female flowers together on the same inflorescence. So this whole thing here collectively is called a spadix. And again, it's basically just an inflorescence containing tons of tiny little flowers that don't have petals. They just have their stamens if they're male and their carpels if they're female. Now let's say that this is a hermaphroditic spadix. It has both male and female flowers on the inflorescence, which is actually the most common arrangement to be found by far. The way they would do this is the male and female flowers wouldn't be active at the same time. So let's say these ones here are male flowers up above, and these ones down here are female flowers. When the male flowers are ready to dump their pollen, the female stigmas aren't receptive yet. Actually, let's mark these guys. So these are the male flowers. These are the female flowers down here. And when the female stigmas are receptive, these male flowers are no longer creating pollen or releasing pollen. And so that's one way to prevent self-fertilization, right? Because you really want the pollen from this plant to go to a different flower of a totally different plant. And you want these stigmas on these female flowers to receive pollen from a different plant so that you get new genes and a mix of genes to produce your offspring, which is the whole point of sexual reproduction. Now, there's a little bit more to this flower than this just long spadix with these little tiny male and female flowers on it. And that is, they are usually covered in this big sheath that kind of wraps around the spadix. And we call that a spathe. And now, hopefully, this inflorescence is starting to look familiar to you if you've ever seen calla lilies, peace lilies, jack in the pulpit, skunk cabbage is a really common one where I live, corpse flowers, all these different types of inflorescences that look like this. They have this kind of spathe wrapped around this spiky looking thing in the middle, which is the spadix. None of these are individual flowers. So often people look at this thing and say, this is a flower, this is a peace lily flower. But what you're really looking at is a complicated inflorescence of many, many flowers along that central corn dog looking thing in the middle, which we call the spadix, and kind of wrapped in this specialized sheath called the spathe. So these Spadices are really cool, really unique inflorescences, and they're a good example of a Pseudanthium, a false flower. Looks like a flower, but it's actually an inflorescence. And how these guys are pollinated is really interesting. Like some of them produce kind of a sweet smell that attracts bees and butterflies and that sort of thing, but most of them go the opposite route. They produce really stinky smells, kind of like poop or rotting flesh, the kind of stuff that attracts flies and in some case beetles. And so these bugs will get attracted by these stinky smells produced down at the base of the inflorescence. And these inflorescences often produce a really, not only a stinky smell, but they produce heat through a process called thermogenesis. So the inflorescence produces heat, has a stinky smell, all the stuff that would be found on a rotting organism, right? There would be heat and there would be a stinky smell. And so the bug, the fly most likely, gets attracted to the heat and the stinky smell, and it goes down to the base of the flower. Now, if it's the time when these male flowers are active, it'll get pollen on it. And if it's the time when the stigmas are active, when the female flowers are active, it'll distribute pollen from a different flower onto those stigmas, causing fertilization and eventually seeds to develop in those ovaries and, you know, the entire plant life cycle. So that's generally how fertilization, pollination works in these Spadices. Really cool flowers. Some of the biggest, again, I almost called it a flower, really cool inflorescences. Again, some of the biggest inflorescences in the world are Spadices. I think maybe the biggest. So if you think of a really big like Titan arum or a corpse flower, these are Spadices. They're usually in the family Araceae. That's our first example of a Pseudanthium, a spadix. The second example of a Pseudanthium that I want to talk about today is a capitulum. So if I ask anyone of any age, but let's say a kid, to draw a flower, they'll probably draw something like this. This kind of daisy-looking flower with that kind of bright yellow middle and then all of these supposed petals around it. But this flower that you would know from any member of the aster family, Asteraceae, sunflowers, daisies, asters, dahlias, all kinds of things, isn't a single flower. What you're looking at here, and this may blow your mind, is an inflorescence. And you might say, how is that possible? I see petals. I see, in many cases, if you look below those petals, there's things that look like sepals sticking out. And then in the middle, we have our anthers and our stamens, the reproductive parts of the flower. This is a flower. Well, no, this is an inflorescence that through the process of convergent evolution looks like a flower, but is actually an inflorescence made of many, many, in some cases hundreds, maybe thousands of flowers all together. So let's take a look at this inflorescence. By the way, this is called a capitulum because it looks like a flower head, and capitulum basically just means head. Caput is the root for head. If you think of the capital, that's the head of a civilization geographically. If you think of a captain, he's the head of the unit, etc., etc. Capitulum means flower head, caput, head. Okay, so let's look at this capitulum up close and we can actually see why it's an inflorescence and not an individual flower. And the best way to do this is maybe to look at it cross-sectionally. So if we turn this, let's say this is a sunflower or a daisy, it doesn't matter, they're all the same. Kind of turn it on its side. We see we have these kind of green bracts surrounding the supposed flower, and those in a normal flower would be the sepals, but this isn't a normal flower. These aren't sepals, these are just bracts. And then in the middle of that, we have a big receptacle that holds what you might think of as being the parts of the flower, but are actually all the different flowers. And on that receptacle, we have all the different flowers that make up this inflorescence. And they all start basically the same way as many flowers do, with ovaries. So this sunflower has a bunch of little flowers within it. I guess it should be called a sun inflorescence instead of a sunflower, but that's a bit pedantic, isn't it? Okay, now, not every little flower within this inflorescence, within this capitulum, is the same. The outer flowers are very specialized and different. And they have something really amazing going on. Their sepals are kind of fused together to make a tube. I should label this stuff. These are the sepals. These guys are all the ovaries. This is just called the receptacle. It basically holds all that stuff. It's the tissue that all that stuff sticks on. These green bracts that go around the surface of the sunflower, together, collectively, all together, we call that the involucre. This is the main stem that holds up the flower head. And since it holds up an inflorescence instead of an individual flower, we call that a peduncle. Okay. And so these sepals are kind of fused together on these outer flowers, and then they basically have all their petals modified into one huge, beautiful petal. And so what looks like the outer petal in the flower is actually a bunch of petals all fused together in these outer flowers of the inflorescence. And for a sunflower, these will be yellow. And when a bunch of petals are all fused together, we call that a corolla. This is the sepal tube. And this whole specially modified outer flower that basically exists to look like a petal, to be pretty, we call that a ray flower or a ray floret, like a little flower, a mini flower, but it is a full flower. It's just modified to be weird. We would say it's an imperfect flower because it doesn't really have sexual organs. It doesn't have carpels. It doesn't have stamens. It does have a little ovary at the bottom, but that's probably just vestigial, left over from when these flowers were all sexually active, instead of this flower being modified to just be pretty. So it's probably just a vestigial ovary, and in almost all cases, it can't be fertilized. It doesn't have fertile eggs in there. In some cases it is, which is kind of neat. It represents that kind of stepping stone in evolution away from a normal full flower to this weird modified flower as part of this larger inflorescence. Now, the whole point of these ray florets is just to look like petals, to be big and pretty, and attract pollinators to these middle flowers, which are actually sexually active, where the pollination actually happens, where seeds are actually produced. So these ovaries in the middle here, these belong to a different type of flower. Now this type of flower has kind of a pretty little yellow corolla that's made from its fused petals. But its fused petals, its corolla, you'll notice, is really tiny compared to these outer big ray flowers. But it's still there. It basically just forms a little tube, kind of like the sepal tube does on these ray flowers, ray florets. And so in this case, that's the corolla. We call that the corolla tube. And then sticking out of that corolla tube, we have our anthers, our stamens, the tips of our stamens, which are kind of fused together also to be kind of a tube. Now typically, these middle flowers have both male and female parts. They're hermaphroditic, they have both stamens and carpels. And just like these outer ray flowers, these middle flowers have their own name. We call them disc flowers. This outer flower is called a ray floret because it forms these kind of beautiful rays, which are just modified corollae to look like the petals of the flower, like sun's rays, right? Those are the rays. These inner flowers that are sexually active, these are the disc flowers or the disc florets, small flowers. And as I said earlier, they have these kind of like stamens sticking up. And at the tip of those stamens are the anthers kind of fused together to make a tube. And how they mature is really interesting. So I went outside and looked at my sunflowers, and I noticed the flowers in the middle basically are immature. Their stamens haven't opened up yet. Then, in kind of the outer ring from the middle, these are the flowers where the stamens are kind of like the pollen from the stamens has been pushed up. And so there's pollen there to get on the bees that come to visit this flower. Now, what's pushing those stamens up is actually the female reproductive structure, the carpel underneath. So as the flower develops, the carpel kind of pushes out of the flower, and eventually you see the big curly stigmas. So let me just label these. Stigmas, that's the female part, obviously. These would be the anthers. Those are the male parts. So all of these flowers are both male and female. They're hermaphroditic, but they mature at different times. So the most mature flowers are female. They have all the pollen pushed out. The stigmas and the styles have kind of pushed out of the tube that's created from the fused stamens. In the next ring of flowers, we have the stigmas haven't pushed out yet. So there's just the tips of the stamens, the anthers, and on those anthers is pollen. And then in the middle, there's the flowers that haven't opened up yet. So all of these different flowers are available in a sunflower that's at varying degrees of maturity. In a young sunflower, it might just be the male flowers. And in a really old sunflower, it might just be the female parts of the flowers are left over. But all of these develop at different times. They're really cool. Okay, so when you look at a capitulum like this, again, you're not looking at a single flower. You're looking at hundreds and hundreds of these disc florets in the middle of the inflorescence, and many of the ray florets ringing the inflorescence. And what you have is an inflorescence that kind of looks like a flower. So it's the macro imitating the micro, because a flower is a good way to reproduce. It's a good way to attract pollinators. It's a good way to get your pollen onto a stigma of a different plant. And so an inflorescence that looks like a flower is using that same essential design, but on a greater level. So why not just have a flower? Why have an inflorescence that looks like a flower? Well, if this were a single flower, you could maybe get multiple ovaries pollinated, that sort of thing. Here, it's hundreds of individual flowers. So there's a great opportunity for pollen to find different stigmas. And each of these individually get fertilized. Each of them have their own unique, or maybe unique, mix of genes down in their eggs, which will eventually become their seeds. And so there's going to be a massive amount of genetic diversity that can come about as a result of pollination in one of these capitula. Again, a capitulum just means head. It's a flower head. It's an inflorescence. And it's an inflorescence that we call a pseudanthium, an inflorescence that looks like a single flower. So next time you look at a daisy or a sunflower, sunflower is probably the best one because it's big, so you can see these things with the naked eye instead of needing a little microscope or dissectoscope. And see if you can identify these outer ray florets and these inner disc florets. It's actually really cool, really interesting, and it's a little thing about the world that you might not have known. Maybe you did, but if you didn't, it's pretty cool, you got to admit, right? There's basically a whole family of flowers that have capitula, and these particular capitula are basically limited to that family. That family is called Asteraceae. It's the aster family, the home of daisies, sunflowers, Jerusalem artichoke, echinacea, dahlias, all those kinds of things that look like this, look like they have capitula. So as I alluded to earlier, if you have something like this, and you have little buds at the tip of each of these, that would be a, what do you say? Did you say umbel? If you said umbel, you're right. Good job. That's an umbel. But I went out there in my garden and I saw some cool plants like cilantro, like carrot flowers, that kind of thing. And I noticed that instead of a bud there, each of these little branch points form another additional umbel. And at the tip of that, that's where all the flower buds are. So what we're looking at here is an umbel of umbels. And we would just call this a compound umbel. I think you can describe it as umbelate or something like that, but we don't need to get too fancy with the names right here. I would just call this a compound umbel or an umbel of umbels. And this is true of basically all of our inflorescence types. They can kind of be mixed and matched to make a bunch of different, weird, complicated inflorescences because there's so much variety out there amongst flowering plants in the world. And so those basic examples that I taught you earlier aren't going to cover all of them. What they will do is they'll give you kind of a palette to work with. So you can just look at this, and if you know what an umbel is, you could say this is an umbel and this is also an umbel. It's an umbel of umbels, right? And it's an umbel because all of these pedicels are the same length, and all of these pedicels are the same length, and all of these pedicels originate from the same point here. So this is an umbel, and all of these guys originate from the same point there. So this is an umbel. So this is an umbel of umbels. If this bottom structure was an umbel, but in the top, instead of having umbels, we had something like maybe spikes. This would be an umbel of spikes or an umbel of spikelets, little spikes, that kind of thing. If they were racemes, it would be an umbel of racemes, right? If we had little pedicels connecting these blooms instead. So we can mix and match these terms to form these more compound, more intricate and involved inflorescences. It gets pretty complicated, but it's also kind of fun to parse it apart. I'm not going to teach you every example here. I think that's way too into the weeds. You can play with it on your own if you're really interested. I will just go over maybe one of the more common examples, and that is If you have a raceme, oh, wrong color. If there's a raceme, and on that raceme we have racemes, we would have a raceme of racemes and that actually has a specific name. We call it a raceme of racemes or something like that, a panicle. Panicles are actually fairly common out there amongst flowering plants. My favorite example of a panicle is a lilac. If you look at a lilac very closely, you'll see that all the little flowers are arranged on little racemes, and those are themselves arranged on a bigger raceme. So raceme of racemes, we call that a panicle. Some examples of panicles include, like agaves, for example, yucca, sorghum. Corn is kind of an interesting one. Let's talk about corn for a moment, because corn is so interesting. Corn has a panicle. If you look at the male flowers up at the top of the plant, you can see that it's like a raceme on a raceme, so a panicle, right? And these male flowers are very simplified. It's basically just a sheath with some stamens hanging down so they can blast their pollen all over the place. But if you look down at the bottom of the corn plant, the female flower is really interesting. It's basically a spike. It has a long central stem, and all the female flowers are just directly attached to that central stem. And of course, the female flowers have this big, long, feathery stigma that they use to capture all the pollen being shed from those male flowers up above, floating in the wind. Corn is a wind-pollinated plant. That's why you want to plant it kind of densely together so the pollen can find all these female flowers. And once those little feathery stigmas get pollinated, the pollen tube goes into the ovary, into the ovule, fertilizes it, forms the fruit, which is a single corn kernel, basically, right? So when a corn cob is basically just a spike with a bunch of leftover ovaries from the female flowers on it, a bunch of fruits attached to that central spike. Okay, so again, corn is one of these more complicated examples. The male flowers on the plant are panicles, but the female flowers are spikes. Again, we can use all these inflorescence terms to kind of mix and match to cover our bases for all these more complicated examples. All the other ones, like a raceme of umbels that also has spikelets or whatever like that, we don't have names for them because they're so, you get to a point where you don't want to name everything in the world when you can use other words to describe them. So again, I don't really use a word for an umbel of umbels. I just call it an umbel of umbels. Or an umbel of spikelets, I would just call it an umbel of spikelets. But for whatever reason, racemes of racemes are so common that we do use a word for that, and that word is panicle. There you go. Okay, as I alluded to at the very beginning of this video, all of the inflorescences we just talked about are indeterminate inflorescences. They don't have a terminal flower bud because they want to allow the stem to keep growing and producing more buds as needed. If it's going to be a short growing season, let's just make a few flowers. If it's going to be a long one, long hot, then let's just keep making lots of flowers until it's time to kind of prepare for winter. That covers the majority of our inflorescences. It doesn't cover all of our inflorescences. And most determinate inflorescences, that is inflorescences that kind of make their flower buds. So let's say that these are kind of roughly all the same length, right? You would look at this and you would say, I have 3 pedicels. They're all, or maybe 2 pedicels in a main stem. They're all coming from the same point. They're the same length. This is an umbel. You would be, I could totally see where you're coming from. That makes a lot of sense to me, but that would be wrong. Because an umbel, and all those terms I taught you earlier, a spike, a raceme, all these terms refer specifically to indeterminate inflorescences. When you have a determinate inflorescence, you just call it a cyme. So this here is a cyme. And again, the reason it's a cyme and not an umbel is because it's not just going to keep growing, it's determinate. And you might say, well, surely umbels are determinate. And like, not really, actually, because an umbel could just keep making more of these little pedicels to kind of fill in more blooms as the season goes along. That's not going to be true with this determinate inflorescence. So determinate inflorescences, we call them cymes, and they get really complicated. So you might say something like a racemose cyme, a raceme-like cyme, or a spike-like cyme, or a cyme that looks like an umbel of umbels, or something like that. And there are specific terms that botanists can use to define these specific cymes. Again, that gets a little too complicated for me, and probably for you as well. So it's much better to just use simpler terminology instead of those specific words. They're available for you to look up if you are interested in them, though. In terms of cymes, remember, cymes can be a simple cyme, and a good example of a simple cyme are basically all of our nightshades. So like tomato, potato, eggplant, bell pepper, that kind of stuff. And then some other, like elderberries, a good example of a more complicated cyme or a compound cyme. Same thing with butterfly bush. These are inflorescences that are kind of like panicles, racemes or racemes, but they're determinate, they're cymes, so they're compound cymes. Remember, all cymes are by nature determinate, not indeterminate. There's one more important thing to talk about with inflorescences now that we've been over all the various types of inflorescences, and that is flowering order. What I mean by this is some inflorescences will have all their buds set, and then they'll start flowering at the bottom, and then as the season goes along, they'll work their way up the stem. Other plants will have their buds set just as the other one, but they'll start flowering at the top. And then maybe these ones will be next, and then they'll work their way down the stem as the season goes along. Now this mode here, where we work our way up towards the top, we call this acropetal. And acro, you can think of as acrobat. Apparently acrobats are known for walking on their tiptoes. That's why they're called acrobat. I didn't know that. But acro just means up or top. We work our way up towards the top. If you've ever been to the Acropolis in Athens, that's up on top of a hill where the Parthenon is found. Because back in the day, that's where the rich people lived, up on top of the hill, the Acropolis. And the hoi polloi would live down below, right? I guess that's not so different from today. Many of the fanciest communities are up on tops of hills. I guess rich people like that sort of thing. So acropetal is when we start flowering. Our flower buds open on the bottom first and then work their way up. Lots of flowers have this acropetal flowering pattern. It's, I think, the most common. I did a big video on camas, Camassia quamish and Camassia leclinii. These plants have raceme inflorescences, and they always start blooming at the bottom first, and then as the season goes along, they work their way up. And this is a great method of blooming for both determinate and also indeterminate inflorescences, right? Because you can keep growing this main stem, you can keep making flower buds, and you can keep blooming up. So if you start below, there's plenty room to grow as the plant grows up. The opposite of that, that's much less common, is basipetal. And this is easy to remember. Just as acro, like acropolis, means up, basi means base. So basipetal, we're working our way down towards the base. The upper buds flower first, and then these base buds are the last ones to go. So we work our way down to the base. A good example of a basipetal inflorescence is mullein, for example. The top buds open first, and then as the season goes along, it works its way down to the lower buds. This really only works with determinate inflorescences, right? Because if the top buds open first, you can't put up any more top buds, right? Because you're working your way down. So this is basically only found in determinate inflorescences where the number of buds have already been set at the beginning of the season. Now, one important thing to remember here with our acropetal and basipetal inflorescences is don't get confused. A lot of students might think acro means the top, so that means the top buds open first, and basipetal means base, so the base buds open first. No. It's not about who opens first. It's about where the inflorescence is going, where the flowering pattern is going. So acropetal actually starts at the bottom, but works its way towards the top. It's directional. Acro means top, we're working our way towards the top. Bicipital starts at the top, but works its way toward the base. It's about the destination. It's about where we're going, bicipital. So there you go. Those are the two main schemes of how flower buds open in an inflorescence. So that was everything that you probably want to know about inflorescences. Hey, maybe more. Important things to remember here is most plants have inflorescences. They don't have single flowers. Most inflorescences are indeterminate. They have more buds as needed instead of a set number of buds over, at the beginning, determinate. And a lot of flowers that might have looked like a single flower before, if you look at them closely now, you'll realize that they're inflorescences, that they're a big mix of a bunch of different flowers. And it's a good strategy to have a bunch of flowers all crammed together, right? Because you increase your chance of at least one of them connecting with your pollinator, or in cases of wind pollination, you can have a spot where you just dump a bunch of pollen. There's a lot of there's good reason that so many plants have these inflorescences. And to our human perspective, they're beautiful. You know, many of the flowers that we enjoy are these gorgeous inflorescences. A single flower like a tulip or a daffodil is also beautiful, but you know, there's something to be said for a big, you know, bush full of beautiful color, or a tall spike of color running up the plant. So thanks for watching as always. I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.